beneath the streets of New Orleans, beneath the jazz that floats through humid midnight air, beneath the laughter spilling from balconies polished by centuries of secrets, there lies a truth the city never wanted spoken aloud. A truth stitched into shadows and mortared into walls. A truth that dripped quietly through time like a bruise no one wanted to acknowledge. They tried to bury it under elegance, under music, under stories of charm and hospitality, but darkness has a way of surviving. And when a secret is built into the bones of a city, it doesn't die. It waits. This story was sealed behind brick, burned in fireplaces that once warmed men with cold intentions, erased from ledgers as if ink itself feared becoming evidence. Yet it did not vanish completely, because one woman refused to let the truth die with her. Her name was Seline, a girl hidden in plain sight, and the diary she slipped into a crack in the wall became the one silent witness to one of the darkest trafficking networks in American history. A diary no one was ever meant to read, a diary that outlived everyone who wanted it destroyed. Tonight, we open the wall they tried to seal forever. Tonight, we walk into the basement where her candle once flickered. Tonight, we read the words of a girl the world was never supposed to remember. And with every page we turn, the city's mask slips a little more. This is the story New Orleans never wanted you to hear. Welcome back to Noctivox Dark Stories, where we reach into the dustiest corners of history and pull out the voices that were never meant to speak again, where we uncover the unsolved tragedies, the buried truths, and the forgotten people who were swallowed by silence long before any of us were here to listen. And tonight, we are stepping into a case unlike anything we've ever explored, a case without a crime scene because the building where it happened was demolished. A case without official witnesses because every person involved either vanished or was erased. A case without records because those in power made sure paper burned, ink dissolved, and testimony drowned under the weight of wealth and influence. All that remained was a diary, a teenage girl's diary, written by trembling hands in the dim glow of a tallow candle. The kind of candle a servant would be given not for comfort, but simply to keep her working. She wrote in the basement of a beautiful French Quarter home, a home filled with music upstairs and misery below. This is not folklore. This is not a ghost story crafted to scare children. This happened in a real house, to real people. And for 90 years no one was supposed to know. But tonight, you and I will walk into that silence together, and we will let the girl who wrote in the dark finally speak in the light. Beneath the shining balconies of New Orleans, beneath the echo of music drifting through Bourbon Street, beneath every lantern-lit alley where tourists laugh without knowing what sleeps under their feet, there lies a secret the city spent a century trying to erase. A secret sealed behind plastered walls, scribbled out of ledgers, and swallowed by men who believed their power would bury truth forever. But truth has a strange way of surviving, especially when a single person refuses to let it die. And that person was a girl named Seline. A girl who should have been invisible to history, just another servant, another shadow, another unpaid life in a house full of silenced souls. But Seline did something no one expected. She wrote in a diary she hid inside the wall of the basement where she slept. Words scratched in candlelight. Words she knew could get her killed. Words that described the rooms no visitor ever saw. The women who were brought in, and the women who never walked out. Her diary was not meant to be found. Yet somehow, it survived the fire, the demolition, the silence, and the fear. And today, it is the only surviving witness to a hidden trafficking network that operated under one of the most respected names in the French Quarter, a network polished with wealth, disguised with charm, and protected by men who understood exactly how the law worked in their favor. Tonight, on Noctivox Dark Stories, we open the wall they tried to seal forever. We read the pages a frightened girl left behind, and we return to a time when the city danced above ground, while horror lived below. This is an investigation into a story that was never meant to escape the basement where it was born. And as we follow Celine's words, we step into a world of shadows, secrets, and stolen lives. A world where every room had two faces, the one for guests, and the one no one dared to speak about. And by the end of this journey, you will understand why Seline wrote her final line with trembling hands. Please remember us. In the 1830s, New Orleans shimmered like a jewel pressed against the edge of the Mississippi, a city that sold itself as a paradise of music, luxury, and endless promise. Wealthy merchants walked marble floors while cotton fortunes climbed higher than the humidity that wrapped itself around every street. Carriages rolled past balconied mansions dripping with ironwork so ornate it looked like lace frozen in metal. And the French Quarter sparkled, a place where perfume from lavish parties mingled with the thick sweetness of magnolia trees. But beneath all of this, beneath the champagne, the violins, and the slow swirl of masked balls, lay a truth the city depended on, but pretended not to see. Human bodies were the economy's hidden currency, and the legal slave markets operated openly under the bright Louisiana sun. Men in linen suits inspected flesh as casually as they inspected horses. Women were catalogued by skin tone, by youth, by obedience, by how quietly they endured being sold from one stranger to another. But even darker than the legal auctions were the illegal networks that thrived in the alleys and behind the shutters of respectable homes. Hidden cells existed in basements where city inspectors never looked. Forged papers turned free women of color into property overnight. Kidnappings were quiet, swift, and expertly organized. A woman walking home from the market could vanish into a carriage and never be seen again. Her name crossed out of one life and written into another. These networks were run by men who understood exactly how to hide in plain sight. And among them stood Etienne Laval, a respected merchant, a generous dinner host, a man who donated to churches and smiled for local portraits. Someone neighbors praised as polite, charming, refined. But behind the carved wooden doors of his French Quarter home, a different world existed, a world of secret staircases, soundproof rooms, and movements that happened after midnight. Laval's reputation was immaculate, his wealth unquestioned, and that was precisely how he kept his secret untouched by suspicion. Because in New Orleans, power didn't just protect men like him, it erased the footprints of anyone who disappeared inside their walls. And when we follow Celine's diary into this glittering yet rotten heart of the city, we begin to see the truth. The brighter the surface of New Orleans shined, the darker the shadows beneath it grew, and in those shadows, Laval built his empire, one stolen life at a time. Josephine's disappearance began, as these things often did, with a polite lie dressed as a reasonable explanation. According to Etienne Laval, the girl had chosen to leave his household, claiming she wished to seek employment elsewhere. He said she departed early in the morning, just after sunrise, slipping away before most of the servants were awake. But the women who worked alongside Josephine knew better. They whispered that she had been acting nervous for days, glancing behind her as she carried laundry through the courtyard, flinching at every unexpected footstep. Josephine had confided to one woman that she feared being sold downriver, the phrase that made every free woman of color sick with dread. And when she vanished, the only person bold enough to challenge Laval's story was Deline Mercier, a seamstress with a quiet voice but an unbreakable spine. Deline had known Josephine for years. She knew Josephine would never depart without saying goodbye, never abandon her sick mother, never step into the world alone without her savings or her belongings. So Deline went to the authorities, not because she hoped for justice. Justice was a privilege reserved for the white and wealthy, but because she refused to pretend ignorance. She accused Laval of orchestrating Josephine's disappearance, and the room went cold. Laval responded with practiced outrage, producing what he called a letter of character, supposedly written by Josephine herself, stating that she left by choice and requesting that no one trouble him over her decision. But the handwriting trembled in all the wrong places. Letters shaped differently than Josephine ever wrote them. Loops too heavy, strokes too sharp, like a man imitating a script he barely remembered. Deline pointed this out boldly, but the clerk glanced at her the way white officials always looked at free women of color, as if their words weighed less, meant less, existed on a lower rung of truth. Laval, meanwhile, sat polished and composed, his wealth doing more talking than his mouth ever needed to. The room leaned toward him automatically, as though his reputation alone proved innocence. But Deline refused to back down. She repeated her accusation, even as the constables shifted uncomfortably, even as Laval's friends muttered about baseless troublemaking. And even as she realized the danger in confronting a man like him, she still said the words out loud. Josephine did not leave of her own free will. And with that single sentence, Seline lit the first spark of the investigation that would ultimately expose the hidden world behind Laval's doors. She stood alone in a court that did not want the truth. But she stood anyway. And that defiance would become the beginning of unraveling a secret no one was supposed to touch. Armand Lenus entered the story the way truth often does, quietly, patiently, and without permission from the men who believed they controlled every narrative in New Orleans. He was a free man of color, educated, sharp-minded, and known for defending those the courts preferred to ignore. And when word of Josephine's disappearance reached him, he agreed to look into it, not because the law demanded it, the law certainly didn't, but because conscience sometimes whispered louder than fear. Lenus began his investigation with the people who lived closest to Laval's world, the neighbors who pretended not to notice things, the vendors who delivered goods without asking questions, the servants who had learned long ago to swallow what they saw. He approached them slowly, gently, understanding the risk each of them faced for simply speaking to him. And piece by piece the silence began to crack. One neighbor mentioned a sudden increase in provisions delivered to Laval's home, far more food than his household could possibly consume. A butcher confessed that he had grown uneasy preparing unusually large orders of bread, meat, and rice, as though someone was feeding far more mouths than appeared at the dining table. And a carriage driver admitted that he had seen a cart leaving Laval's property late at night, covered with a tarp, its wheels rolling softly through streets where no honest business traveled after midnight. Every story Lenus collected felt like a fragment of a map, each detail pointing towards something hidden, something alive beneath the surface. Servants quietly spoke of footsteps in parts of the house guests never entered. A maid described rooms that were kept locked at all times, yet always smelled faintly of soap and fear. A stable boy claimed he once heard crying from beneath the floorboards while sweeping the courtyard at dawn. And although none of this was enough to charge a man as powerful as Laval, it was enough to confirm that Josephine had not vanished of her own accord. As Lenus's questions grew sharper, the tension thickened, stretching over the French Quarter like a storm waiting to break. Because in a city where everyone understood how fragile a free life could be, speaking against a wealthy merchant was an act of courage and desperation combined. And soon enough, word of Lenus's inquiries reached Laval himself. The shift was immediate. Servants grew more guarded, deliveries were rerouted, and men loyal to Laval appeared on street corners with folded arms and narrowed eyes. But Lenus refused to retreat. He pressed further, forcing cracks into a story Laval had crafted with meticulous care. And it was at this exact moment, when pressure pressed against the walls of Laval's secrets, that Seline's diary first hints at fear seeping into the household. Her entries grow hurried, ink smeared, sentences clipped and anxious. She describes whispers among the staff, frantic cleaning in the basement, and rooms being emptied in the dead of night. She writes that Laval moved through the house with the cold sharpness of a man preparing for a storm he did not intend to lose. And as her candlelight flickered against the damp stone walls, Seline knew something was coming. Because whenever powerful men feel danger closing in, the people trapped beneath them are always the first to feel the tremors. And in that trembling darkness, she began writing the pages that would outlive everyone who tried to silence her. She was young, powerless, and trapped inside a house built on silence, yet she still felt complicit simply by existing inside its walls. That's when she began hiding her diary. She writes that she slipped it into a crack behind a loose stone near her bed, praying one day someone, anyone, would find it long after she was gone. She didn't know if she would survive long enough to finish it. She didn't know if the truth would matter. But she kept writing, because it was the only resistance she had left. And in those final entries of this section, her fear sharpens into something cold and heavy. "I think they will move me next," she writes, the sentence shaking with ink blotches and trembling strokes. She heard Laval speaking her name. She heard a door unlocking that was never meant for her. She writes of footsteps outside the basement, slow and deliberate, as though someone was deciding her fate just inches away. Yet she still wrote. She still carved her truth onto those pages, believing that if her voice could not escape her body, maybe her words could escape the walls. And as we read her diary now, nearly 2 centuries later, Seline's voice becomes the emotional center of this entire story. It is through her eyes that we witness the machinery of cruelty, through her terror that we feel the weight of those hidden rooms, and through her desperate hope that someone would one day remember her, we understand the deepest truth of this investigation, that even in silence, even in darkness, even in fear, she fought to exist, and her diary is the proof she left behind. On the afternoon of April 5, 1833, the city recorder arrived at the Laval residence accompanied by 2 constables and Armand Lenus, the determined free man of color who had been quietly gathering evidence for weeks. The house on Royal Street appeared ordinary, even elegant, bathed in the golden light of a New Orleans spring afternoon. The city officials moved through the rooms with clipboards and measured steps, inspecting service areas, kitchens, storage rooms, and even the basement, which by all accounts had been the site of so much terror. The official report would later state that every corner was examined thoroughly, that no evidence of wrongdoing was found, that no hidden cells existed, that the household's enslaved people confirmed they were treated well, and that Etienne Laval had cooperated fully and expressed dismay at the accusations. On paper, it was a perfect record, a clean conclusion that swept away all suspicion. But Lenus knew better. He had seen the signs of panic in the house days before, the way the rooms had been scrubbed, the walls whitewashed, the doors to secret spaces sealed with fresh mortar. And now he could see the evidence of a staged performance. The whitewash was still slightly damp in places. The mortar lines were fresh, almost too perfect, and the household's enslaved people seemed rehearsed in their answers, their eyes avoiding his gaze, their voices measured and careful. Lenus wrote a private letter to a colleague describing what he had seen and felt, that the inspection was a farce, that all incriminating materials had been removed or destroyed, that the facade of respectability had been restored just in time. He described one girl, Seline, who would not meet anyone's eyes, whose fear hung in the air like a heavy curtain. In that letter he confessed the terrible truth that knowing and proving were not the same thing, that the law protected men like Laval while leaving the women who had disappeared entirely vulnerable. And yet, despite his diligent investigation, the legal machinery ground on April 12, 1833, the case was officially closed. No charges were filed. Deline Mercier's complaint was dismissed for lack of evidence. Laval walked free, his reputation intact, his wealth and social standing untouched by the brief storm of suspicion. In the eyes of the law and society, the incident had never happened. The hidden rooms, the women moved under cover of night, the documents burned to ash, all of it disappeared without a trace. But for those who had witnessed it, Seline, Lenus, and Mercier, the memory could not be erased, and the truth survived in whispers, hidden letters, and the pages of a diary tucked away for decades. The official record would tell one story, a story of innocence and order, but the private letters, the fear, the traces of fresh mortar, and the diary itself told another. A story of deception, terror, and a carefully orchestrated performance that allowed a man like Laval to escape accountability, while the women he trafficked vanished into silence. In the days following the inspection, Celine's diary entries became more fragmented, more desperate, a window into a mind and heart under unimaginable pressure. She writes of the house emptied of women, the hidden cells dismantled, the papers burned, and the constant fear that she would be next. The air itself seems to press down on her as she describes hearing her masters argue, their words carrying a weight that chills her to the bone. "They are going to send me away," she writes. "I heard Master and Madame arguing last night. She said I had become a liability, that my presence in the house attracted the wrong kind of attention. He said he had already made arrangements for me to leave within the week." She does not write these words casually. Each sentence carries the tremor of dread, the tightrope between survival and disappearance. She records the false reassurances given to her about a household in Mobile, a gentleman who supposedly desired her qualities, but she does not believe him. She understands the machinery of trafficking too well, knows the shadows too intimately, and senses that she is being moved into the same network that consumed the others she had seen vanish. And yet, despite the terror, Seline writes with courage, with a determination to leave a record, to assert her existence even as the forces of invisibility close around her. In her final entry, penned on the morning of April 14, 1833, she writes with clarity and urgency, "If this diary is ever found, please know that I did not go willingly into whatever darkness awaits me. Please know that the women who disappeared from this place were real people with names, families, and futures that were stolen from them. Please know that behind the beautiful facades of this city, there exists a machinery of cruelty that grinds up human lives and spits out profit. My name is Seline. I was born somewhere in Louisiana. My mother was enslaved, my father unknown to me. People say I am beautiful, but this beauty has been a curse, not a blessing. If you are reading this, I am likely already gone. But please remember that I existed, that I saw, that I tried in my small way to leave a record, that I was more than property, more than an inventory line, more than a body to be bought and sold. Please remember us." With these words, the diary stops. The pages that follow are blank, and Seline disappears from the historical record as abruptly and terrifyingly as the women she had documented. No bills of sale, no travel records, no letters, no further testimony. Only fragments, hints, and whispers that suggest she may have been sent to Mobile, held briefly, and then shipped to Cuba, beyond the reach of anyone who could search for her. But there is no certainty, only the haunting echo of her final plea. The plea to be remembered, to bear witness, to survive in memory, even if she did not survive in life. And in that absence, the power of her words becomes undeniable. For decades, they wait, hidden in a wall, waiting for someone, anyone, to find them and listen, to carry forward the story of Seline and the women whose lives were stolen in silence. In those final days, Seline transforms from witness to historian, from victim to voice, leaving behind a legacy of testimony that refuses to be erased, a reminder that even in disappearance, a story can endure. After Seline vanished from the New Orleans records, the trail grows faint, but fragments remain, ghostly traces of her existence scattered across time and space. A newspaper notice in the Mobile Register, dated May 1833, offers the first hint of her possible fate. Reward offered for information regarding the whereabouts of a young woman of color, approximately 19 years of age, of notable appearance, believed to have arrived in Mobile from New Orleans in late April. Family seeking to locate. Inquiries directed to. The notice ran only once, a fleeting plea in a city that was already busy with its own commerce and gossip. It disappeared as quickly as she did, leaving no answers. Then, a ship manifest from May 1833 shows the departure of the merchant vessel Celeste from Mobile, bound for Havana, listing among its cargo 4 units of domestic merchandise, a chilling euphemism for human lives trafficked illegally, lives sold and transported as property, far beyond the reach of any relatives or would-be rescuers. And decades later, during an estate settlement of Etienne Laval, a ledger entry dated May 15, 1833, records final commission on sale, premium price received, account closed, small bureaucratic lines on paper that mask the suffering of a young woman ripped from her home, from the streets of New Orleans, and sent into the shadowed networks of trafficking that operated with impunity. When we place these fragments together, a tragic narrative emerges. Seline likely went from New Orleans to Mobile, held briefly, and then shipped to Cuba, a part of the same system that had already claimed the other women she had witnessed disappearing. And her story, while unique in its survival through the diary she hid, is far from singular. Across the American South, similar operations existed in Charleston, Richmond, Mobile, and beyond. Women of color, both free and enslaved, were kidnapped, sold, transported, and erased. Their lives treated as invisible, their suffering accounted for only in secret ledgers or whispered recollections. Seline's diary gives voice to this system, but the historical record confirms that such disappearances were tragically common. The law offered little protection, and societal power structures favored the perpetrators, allowing men like Laval to continue their operations with little fear of consequence. Yet even in these fragments, in the hints left by a fleeting newspaper notice, a ship manifest, a ledger entry, Seline's existence persists. Her path may be obscured, her life uncertain, but through careful reconstruction, we can trace the outline of her journey. We can see the machinery that sought to erase her, and we can honor her memory by refusing to let her story disappear entirely. These fragments, small as they are, remind us that even in the absence of full records, human lives, human suffering, and human resistance leave traces that demand to be seen and acknowledged. The trail of Seline seems to vanish into the Caribbean, swallowed by the networks of human trafficking that the law refused to see until, 14 years later, a name emerges in the Cuban archives. In 1847, a woman identified as Selena Morena Libe brings a freedom suit against a plantation owner in Havana, claiming she had been held illegally for 14 years despite being a free woman of color. Her testimony is hauntingly familiar, a mirror of the experiences Seline described in her diary. She recounts being born in Louisiana, educated by nuns, held in a New Orleans household where women were trafficked and sold illegally. She describes being forcibly transported to Cuba in 1833, a young woman stolen from the city she knew, sent into a network that had consumed so many like her. The suit is fragmentary, the documents incomplete, but the resonance is undeniable. The circumstances, the dates, the details of her captivity, all echo the diary Seline had hidden in the walls of Royal Street. Remarkably, the court rules in her favor, granting her freedom in 1848 on the grounds that her enslavement had been illegal from the outset. The possibility that Seline survived, endured 14 years of illegal captivity, and fought for her liberty is both uplifting and heartrending. We cannot know for certain that Selena Morena Libe is the same Selena who wrote by candlelight, hiding her words in plaster to survive beyond the walls of her prison, but the parallels are too striking to ignore. This potential reappearance transforms the story from one of disappearance to one of resilience, a small triumph over the machinery of trafficking that sought to erase her. It invites us to imagine her courage, her determination, and her will to assert her personhood in a world that sought to deny it at every turn. Even if the certainty eludes us, the possibility that Seline survived, reclaimed her life, and bore witness in a court of law is profoundly compelling. It reminds us that human lives are not merely records in ledgers, names in inventories, or entries on ship manifests. They are voices, struggles, and acts of resistance that persist even when systems of power try to silence them. Selena Morena Libe's suit may be our only glimpse of what happened to Seline after she disappeared from the streets of New Orleans, a reminder that survival, though uncertain and perilous, was sometimes possible, and that the spirit of those who endured could leave traces strong enough to reach us across decades and borders, whispering back the truth that slavery tried so desperately to erase. Etienne Laval's life continued almost entirely undisturbed after the 1833 investigation. His reputation remained unblemished. His wealth grew, and the public remembered him as a respectable merchant, a pillar of the New Orleans community. City directories list him at the same Royal Street address through the 1840s, and he served on the board of a local bank, contributed to cathedral construction, and maintained the appearance of civic virtue. When he died in 1851, at the age of 63, from yellow fever, his obituary described him as a gentleman of the old Creole families whose business acumen enriched the city, with no mention of the accusations that had threatened him decades earlier. His widow Marguerite died 2 years later, leaving an estate inventory listing furniture, silver, art, property, and 15 enslaved people, reduced to line items in an asset column, their names barely remembered. The Royal Street property itself changed hands over the decades, and during the Civil War and Reconstruction, it fell into disrepair. By the 1880s, the building was divided into multiple apartments, and by the early 20th century, it became a boarding house. Then, in 1923, during urban renewal and demolition projects, workers uncovered an anomaly in the basement, a narrow corridor leading to 4 small rooms with heavy doors and iron brackets set into the walls. The whitewash on the walls had yellowed, but beneath it, faint scratches were visible, marks of fingernails and carved words, "Help us," "Remember," along with names barely legible. The discovery was briefly noted in the New Orleans Times-Picayune, but it drew little attention. The building was demolished, the basement filled in, and a parking lot constructed above it. Decades later, in 1962, that lot was paved into a small plaza, and today, tourists walk across it unaware of the history buried beneath their feet, oblivious to the suffering that was systematically erased. In 2015, a small bronze plaque was installed at the site, barely 12 inches across, mounted at eye level, reading, "On this site stood a residence where, in the 1830s, women of color were illegally trafficked and held captive." This plaque honors the memory of those women whose names have been lost to history and particularly remembers Seline, whose diary provides testimony to these crimes. May we never forget the human cost of slavery and the courage of those who witnessed and survived. Ghost stories circulate among local guides and residents, whispers of weeping, scraping, and voices that seem to emerge from the foundations. These tales are not for entertainment, they are echoes of trauma, traces of lives that were stolen, lives that were erased but left residual grief in the very walls. Celine's diary survives as one voice among many, defiant and enduring, a record of courage against a system that sought to annihilate her and the women she witnessed being destroyed. The hidden rooms, the faint scratches, the plaque, and the whispered stories all testify to a history that refused to stay buried. Laval's public life continued unscathed, but the spaces he thought he could erase bear witness to the crimes, to the voices of women who were never supposed to be remembered, and to Celine's insistence that their existence, and her own, not be forgotten. And so we return to the words Seline left behind in the quiet darkness of a hidden wall, her plea echoing across nearly 2 centuries. Please remember us. Simple, yet powerful. A command and a testament, a reminder that memory itself can resist the machinery of erasure. Seline understood what those who lived in power often try to forget, that every life taken, every woman trafficked, every voice silenced leaves a void, a scar in the human story that cannot be fully hidden, no matter how meticulously records are destroyed or histories rewritten. Her diary, carefully concealed, was more than writing. It was a lifeline thrown to the future, a refusal to let the system claim her story completely. Today, when we read her words, when we speak her name, when we acknowledge the women she witnessed being trafficked, we honor that lifeline. We transform what was once invisible into remembrance. In recognizing the horrors that were inflicted, in acknowledging the courage of Seline and those who survived, we confront the uncomfortable truth that the prosperity of cities like New Orleans was built on human suffering, and that the consequences of those hidden networks of exploitation ripple into our world today, shaping inequality, silencing marginalized voices, and reminding us that the past is never as distant as we might hope. Remembering Seline is not only an act of honoring her courage, it is a commitment to seeing, to listening, and to acknowledging the human cost of systems that commodified people as property. Her diary, the faint scratches behind demolished walls, the stories that survive in whispers. These are the fragments we can hold on to. They are testimonies that insist we cannot look away. So tonight, as we close this chapter of Noctivox Dark Stories, we carry forward her plea. Remember Seline, remember Josephine, Adelaine, Celeste, and the 14 others whose names were almost lost to history. Remember that beauty, courage, and witness existed even in the darkest corners, and that memory is the act of resistance against erasure. Let her story remind us that history is not only about dates and documents, it is about lives, voices, and truths that demand acknowledgement. And in honoring them, we reclaim a small measure of justice that those who sought to destroy it could never take away. Thank you for joining Noctivox Dark Stories, for walking with us into the shadows of history, and for carrying the stories of the silenced forward into the light. We will remember because she asked us to, and because forgetting is not an option.